In Revelation 2, verse 2, Jesus Christ, Yeshua the Messiah, is giving praise to individuals that rejected evil men and their teachings and tested those who claimed to be apostles but were not actually true apostles of his. So Yeshua is saying that there are some that claim to be apostles but really are not. And in this talk, I'm going to refer to the origin story of the so-called Apostle Paul and present evidence and reasoning that show Paul fails the test and so is not actually the 13th apostle of Yeshua, but he's a false apostle, a false prophet, and he's deceived millions of people into following a different gospel, what actually corresponds to what Jesus also referred to in Revelation 2 as the gospel of the Nicolaitans, which, if we were to translate into modern terms, is basically a teaching of moral relativism or moral nihilism. So basically a rejection of sound ethics and replacing it with something else, which definitely, I would say, also corresponds with the overall message of this so-called apostle who turns us away from the greatest commandments of Jesus, turns us away from his statements that say to love him is to keep his commandments, turn us away from the fact that when he was asked, what is the way to eternal life? He said, to keep the commandments. Turn us away from the fact that Yeshua, the Son of God, said that unless our righteousness exceeds that of the Pharisees or religious authorities, will by no other means enter the kingdom of heaven. The same Son of God who said to sin no more, to stop sinning, to both men and women, right? This all begins with this origin story, right? The legitimacy of this so-called apostle all begins with this story, which he holds as the key to his apostleship. And what's the main problem with this story? Well, I'll say it immediately. The main problem with that story is that Saul, his name originally was Saul, Saul of Tarsus, claims that he saw a vision of Jesus in the wilderness after his death and resurrection. He had this vision of Jesus. So Jesus had this second coming, but just to Paul. And in this vision, he quotes a pagan god of drunkenness and violence. So I'm going to get into the details on that, and I'm also going to explain how those that defend Saul, known today as the Apostle Paul, those that defend him employ psychological characteristics similar to or identical to members of a cult, people that follow a particular cult leader. So let's start with quoting Paul and analyzing what's being said here. So in this quote, Paul was still referred to as Saul, and Saul is saying that Jesus is speaking to him when and says the following to him. and this is in Acts 26:14. So this is in the New Testament of the Bible, in the book of Acts, chapter 26, verse 14. Quote, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads. End quote. So, what is this statement? It is hard for you to kick against the goads. It's an odd statement. I think it's fair to say. It certainly struck my ears as odd the first time I heard it, and I wasn't sure what it even meant, as I'm sure is the same for many people. What does this mean, hard to kick against the goads? It almost sounds perverse. Well, goads is a word that actually is referring to what we could call thorns, like thorns of a cactus, or stingers, like a stinger of a bee. And so this phrase, it's hard for you to kick against the goads, is saying it's difficult to kick against something with thorns or stingers, right? Like if you were to kick a cactus or if you were to kick over a beehive, right? It's going to cause you difficulty. Some Bibles translate this word goads as pricks. Again, that's still not very clear. But the main problem with this statement is that it's actually quoting a Greek god, in particular the Greek god Dionysus. So this god Dionysus was a son of Zeus. But before I talk more about Dionysus, I'll give you the reference here. So this is from Euripides' Bacchae. So it was a Greek play. Euripides lived from in the 400s before Christ, right? And this play, the Bacchae, was focused on the worship of this Greek god, Dionysus. And in that play, this Greek god, Dionysus, says those words. And he's saying them actually to this king Pentheus, who opposed Dionysus and was trying to lead his people away from worship of him. He actually forbid membership in the cult of Dionysus. And because of this, Dionysus was upset with him and actually murdered him for it. So before I go on further, let's just have a reality check here, shall we? We're being told that Yeshua, right, Jesus Christ, the Son of God, casually quotes a pagan god in conversation, right? Really? Do you think any of the original 12 apostles would believe that? Any of his true followers? Right? Quoting a pagan god. You don't think that's at least maybe borderline even, at least idol worship, right? Maybe possibly violating the first of the 10 commandments that says, you shall have no other gods before me, right? That's the Creator speaking. That you won't have any or worship any other gods. You really think Jesus would reference one of these gods? Did he do that during his ministry at all? Absolutely not. Right? So, some critical thinking here, some independent critical thinking is necessary, right? Because the Paulinist church will say, oh, this is no big deal, and they'll try and spin it into nothing. They'll say, oh, it's not really quoting Dionysus, it's, Paul wasn't really claiming that, and that. They'll just be, as usual, as per usual, when anyone has any good criticism of the letters of Paul, they just spin it into perfection, right? Paul actually said nothing wrong, right? It's just these foolish people that don't understand him, right? These foolish people that aren't taking in the full context, aren't, understanding the time in which it was said, etc., right? It was just a saying, no big deal, right? Similarly, they'll say the same about Paul's words in Ephesians 6:5 and 1 Timothy 6:1 through 2, where Paul explicitly endorses or supports abusive slavery, telling slaves that they should just accept the abuse of slavery because it's actually the will of God. They'll try and spin that too, right? And it goes on with major problems with the teachings of Paul. But here, I want to focus in on this origin story and this claim that Yeshua HaMashiach just casually quotes Dionysius. So again, Dionysius is the son of Zeus, and he's known as a god of ritual madness and drunkenness. Does that sound at all like someone Jesus would want to associate with or promote in any way or reference? Of course not. Do you think Jesus was unaware that this was a quote from this Greek play about the worship of Dionysius? Right, the Son of God? Right? Just he didn't realize that this was basically word for word quoting this Greek god. And so then, being the Son of God, he must have known that, right? And so then it's suggesting, well, he didn't think it was a big deal. Maybe he was just using language, appropriate to the time and place. Somehow, Paulinus might try and twist it that way. Really? He would quote a pagan god, a violent pagan god. He couldn't think of any other way to communicate to Paul at that time other than quoting a pagan god. A pagan god known to be insanely violent towards both men and women. Even inspired women to ritually sacrifice their husbands. Right? You really think Jesus would just casually use wording like that? Does this even if it wasn't quoting a pagan god, does it even sound like something Jesus would say? It's hard for you to kick against the goads. Right? What did Jesus say about his true followers? That they knew his voice, right? But they wouldn't follow the voice of a stranger, right? Do you really know the voice of Jesus? Do you really know who he was? Or will you just believe anything anyone says about him, including this previous bounty hunter, killer of Christians, right? Followers of Yeshua, who supposedly had a change of heart on the road to Damascus when he had this vision out in the wilderness. In Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 3, verse 7, he says that through his lie, God's truth is furthered. Now again, if you were to ask your Paulinist pastor about this, they'd immediately assure you, oh no, it's not what it seems. He's not really saying that he's a liar. He's not admitting that. He's being misunderstood once again, right? Sure. In 2 Corinthians 12:16, Paul says, "The devious person that I am, I took you in by deceit." Oh, but again, the Paulinist pastor will say, Paul is being misunderstood here. He's not really admitting to being a devious person who deceives people and takes them in. What does that even mean? Take them in, right? Take them into your cult, perhaps? No, I'm misunderstanding, right? Just like I misunderstand Ephesians 6:5, and I misunderstand 1 Timothy 6:1 through 2, and I misunderstand when Paul speaks against keeping the commandments that Yeshua clearly emphasized was necessary to love him and enter the kingdom of heaven. I just don't know what I'm talking about at all. My reasoning is just foolishness, right? That's what they'll claim.